Hey listeners, it's Natalie. I talked with a legend for this episode, Will Bonsall, and I am really excited to bring this conversation to you. Will is legendary for his seed-saving efforts, the Scatterseed Project, as well as his radical homesteading in Western Maine. A few things before we get going. First, we had to reschedule this interview so many times for various reasons, including car crashes, floods, power outages. Oh my gosh, it was too many. And then when I finally had him on the phone, I had some technical issues with my recorder. Yeah, I upgraded from an iPhone 6 or something with the audio jack. That's how old it was. Anyway, so I had technical issues and I was a little bit panicked, and moments like this really drive home why I am not cut out to be an astronaut. I don't work well under the stress of technology not working the way I needed to, but I ended up recording him on speakerphone into my mic. I know the sound quality isn't the best, but the quality of the conversation, I hope, will make up for it. And I thank Michael, who edits and produces these podcasts, for patience with me. Yeah, sorry about that. Anyway, Will is the first to admit that he's not a market gardener and that some of the things he does on his homestead aren't feasible if you're trying to make a living selling food, but many of them are. And I love his approach to what he calls eco-efficiency. I also want to say that I know dietary choices and farming decisions surrounding livestock can be really contentious. And yes, Will practices veganic farming and is himself a vegan. Even if that's not your approach, there's a lot to learn from how Will has designed his systems to use plants to their maximum capacity and to try to make the most of his land. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden Podcast is brought to you by Local Line. Get ahead this year with Local Line. Local Line is the all-in-one sales platform for farmers and food hubs. Increase your sales and streamline your processes with features including e-commerce, inventory management, subscriptions, online payments, and more. Trusted by thousands of farmers around the world, Local Line is the platform that you need to take your farm to the next level. Subscriptions start as low as $39 a month. Try Local Line today and receive a free premium feature for 1 year using our coupon code NOTILL, all caps, one word, at localline.ca. That's localline.ca, code NOTILL. Today's episode is also brought to you by High Mowing Organic Seeds. It's seed browsing season, and High Mowing Organic Seeds is celebrating their 30 new seed varieties for 2024. These beautiful and productive vegetable, flower, and herb varieties are 100% organic, non-GMO project verified, and trialed for optimal performance in organic growing systems. Whether you're trying to bring your best to your CSA, wholesale assortment, or to the weekly farmers market, High Mowing has the professional quality seeds and the grower rep support you need to help get you to harvest. Visit highmowingseeds.com and sign up for your free catalog today. That's highmowingseeds.com. All right, enjoy the show.
So I've been hearing about you for years, so it's a treat to get to talk to you. And if you could just, I know you've done a lot of things in your life, but if you could just introduce yourself to the audience, kind of, who you are, what you do, where you are in particular, that would be great.
Okay. First of all, my name is Will Bonsall, and I'm 74 years old. And I came to this place, which is in Western Maine, to my land. Right out of college back in 1971. So I've been here for pretty many years, and I've basically been devoted my whole life to trying to be self-sufficient in various ways, particularly growing my own food and stuff. And more recently, I've gotten off in new tangents, which I may or may not live to follow through on, but which keep me very busy. I started off, when I got out of college, I had a degree in anthropology, which I didn't intend to do anything with, and essentially have not done anything with. And whereas I should have done more time studying horticulture or something. So I basically did that here on the land as I lived here and learned as I went along. Because of that, I've usually screwed up again and again. I've had almost everything I've done in my life I've had to at least do twice. Do it once and then do it again right, as I've learned from my mistakes. or hopefully learn from my mistakes. And so here I am moving ahead with it all. I recently was in a serious car accident, so I've been stove up for quite a few weeks now and having trouble getting around, but things are getting much better that way. My focus in the very beginning was on growing my own food, and not just my vegetables and things like that. Since I was a vegan pretty much from the very beginning, growing all my vegetable plant foods, but also staple foods like my grain and soybeans and all that kind of thing. Not just zucchini and cherry tomatoes and stuff. And so my focus was very much on that. And very early in this adventure, I came to the conclusion. I started to be vegetarian way back when I was in college, not vegan, but vegetarian. And it was mainly influenced mainly by trends, by peer models and trends at the time. This was during Vietnam and Watergate and all that stuff was going on. And I was basically reacting like pretty much everyone else was. And vegetarianism seemed to make sense to me. But it wasn't until much later when I was here and trying to really grow my own food. And that I realized I started trying out I was going to have dairy goats, among other things, and began to realize that there was very problematic. If I was actually going to really be self-sufficient, I was not only going to grow my own food, my animal foods and everything, but I was also going to have to grow the feed for those animals. I wasn't into just buying stuff in. And I realized how impractical that was. I tried doing it to try to mow all the hay for them, make all the hay and grow the grain, all the stuff to keep these animals. It just became absurd. I can see immediately that it wasn't going to work. And again, by the way, that's one of the main things that has guided my adventures is because I was not doing stuff commercially. I was doing stuff, I was shooting for kind of a closed circle, trying to deal with all parts of take responsibility for as many aspects of my life as possible. And that made a lot of things become glaringly obvious that otherwise might not have. And the veganic cider is a very good example. I could tell that it wasn't working because I was doing it myself. If I had been buying in fertilizer, buying in seed, buying in feed for animals and things like that, it would have been, in fact, it had become glaringly obvious that this did not make sense. But if I'd been willing to just buy things and then turn them into food and then sell them, it would not have been so obvious. I guess what I'm trying to say is the marketplace obscures an awful lot of things. A lot of things may seem to make sense economically, which don't make sense ecologically. Sure. And sometimes don't make sense in any way. And that became really, really obvious because of my insistence, my obsession with doing it myself, controlling all the aspects of it. A lot of things became obvious. I'm very appreciative of the fact that I did that mistake, I can't call it a mistake, that focus, because it was kind of like, in the beginning, it was more like trying to be almost more of a romantic notion. I'm going to be self-sufficient, I'm going to do it all myself. But as the reality of it hit home, I just, again, became very obvious that some of this stuff just doesn't make sense. And I got to find a better way of doing it. And that's when I began realizing that growing my own food is much easier if I was only doing it with plant foods. This is aside from all of the usual reasons for people getting into veganism. The compassion thing, that's great, but that wasn't my total focus. Even today, I kill animals. I kill potato bugs and pest animals and things like that if I have to. Mm-hmm. I wasn't obsessed with violence, although that was a good thing to aim for. Is just simply trying to have controlling all the pieces of myself.
Yeah, and you use an expression in your book of kind of cake mix farming or cake mix gardening, and it reminds me of that. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that versus your approach?
Yeah, exactly. And again, that's like I say, most people, including myself in the beginning, the idea of growing food was to bring things in from somewhere else. You buy in some phosphate, some sulfamag, you buy in some manure, reverse fertilizer and lime and stuff. And you put them in the soil, and the soil now looks like it's rich, and so you grow a lot of things in it, and you send them off to the market. And that's what I mean by cake mix gardening. When you when you just put some pieces together, regardless of their origin, and you have a result, and you don't necessarily get to see the big picture. Does this make sense or not? So that's what I've always tried to avoid, it being a cake mix grower.
And so you kind of, you don't define yourself necessarily as a farmer. What would you say you are? I guess for the listeners, how do you support yourself?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have a difficulty to define myself, as you just said. Am I a gardener or am I a farmer? Because on the one hand, gardeners basically just grow some of their food. They do not grow all of their food. They generally do not grow grain and things like that. They usually grow vegetables. And they usually are a very small scale. Well, I am very small scale. I'm growing on a part of an acre. I'm not using rolling acres of crops with machinery and stuff. So in some ways, I defy the usual concept, preconception we have of a farmer. In some ways, I'm not really a gardener either. I'm some one of those. It's hard. Those labels don't work too well for me. But basically, I have not grown stuff for sale. In the very beginning, I started trying to do that, and I found that I sucked at it. I was not very good. I was good at growing food, but not that good at selling it. I'm not a very good businessman. And so that's when I increasingly realized that the most cost-effective thing that I could do with food that I grew was to eat it, not to sell it. In other words, to not so much focus on my income as to reduce my outgo. And so, again, this focus on self-sufficiency, which sounds very good, it's very romantic, sounds nice, it's really cool to do that. It's not quite as easy as that, and I've been at varying degrees of success at it. But over the years, basically, particularly until recent years when I've had more issues that have made it more difficult to do so, I have grown a very big percentage of my food, including much of my grain, not all of it by any means, and staple foods as well as vegetables.
And I'm reminded a little bit of the Nearings, just in terms of you've had this tremendous influence in the farming and gardening, but yeah, I mean, to be perfectly, realistic about it, that's not where you're making money. So, but you can still have an influence in how people think about the whole system.
Yeah, in fact, that was always for us as kind of a cautionary tale. We were, for a while, we were in contact with Nearings, at least with Helen, after Scott died, and we communicated with her occasionally. And their assumption, we were always reluctant to identify with them. People always assumed, that we hadn't even read most of their books for that matter. People always assumed that we were modeling ourselves, and she always assumed that we were modeling after them. And in fact, we were doing this before I'd ever even heard of them. And their focus was in some ways very misleading. We tried to avoid being misleading ourselves, saying that we're growing 90% of our food when in fact, growing a stock of grain or whatever. We never did claim a particular level of self-sufficiency. On the other hand, we did grow quite a lot of grain. So we were trying to avoid that. They were much older, of course, and they were coming out of this more of a romantic idea of back to the land, which I was initially too. Is that we're growing all our own food, even if you don't really look very hard at what you're growing and what you're not growing. So we very much admired what they did do, and particularly at their age, but also would try to be careful, be aware of what they didn't do and what they implied they were doing, and other people assumed they were doing. We just tried not to do that ourselves.
Yeah. You have written some books, and I really enjoyed reading your Essential Guide to Radical Self-Reliant Gardening. And one of the sections that I loved was your kind of in-depth discussion about mulch. And I'm also very passionate about mulch. And you kind of define the distinction between the living and the dead mulch. But you also don't use any mulch from animal sources. So I was hoping you could just talk about mulch, your approach to mulch, what you do use. Also, the specific logistics. Like I loved reading about how you shred your leaves. So yeah, just have at it with mulch.
Yeah. There, in some ways, there's nothing particularly radical or about our most of the aspects of our mulching are more or less what other people do with mulch, with some major caveats there. For one thing, initially I tried very hard not to use any fossil fuel inputs at all, including machinery in the beginning. I've moved away from that. I don't use large machinery, don't use tractors and stuff, but I do use rototiller to some extent. Not completely no-till, although I try to move in that direction as much as I can. But I do use a gravely walking tractor with a rotary mower on it too. That's how I do most of the mowing. I don't use a scythe. I don't use a scythe. But the only thing I use a scythe for is some green manures I'll mow, or some difficult, hard to get at areas like the edges of terraces. I might use a scythe for. But I do a lot with the mower, and that's how I generate that part of the mulch. But much more than hay, and I've got enough hay land since I'm not feeding livestock. I've got quite a lot of hay field that I can use for mulch. But more than that, what I consider much more sustainable is leaves. And there's a concept that I've focused a lot on, and I do in my book, as you mentioned. And as far as I know, I've invented the word that I use for it, which is eco-efficiency. And eco-efficiency basically means you look at all of the externalities, all the inputs into your system, and you ask the question where it comes and whither and whence. Where does it come from and where is it going to? And by doing so, I start finding out some things make more sense than other things. And if we look at our gardens, the actual food plants we grow and that we eat are not very eco-efficient, because what it means is it takes a great deal. We put a lot of inputs into them compared to what we get out of them, whether it's food that we put in our tummy or whether it's fertility that we put into the soil. And some things make more sense than others. Any plant is far more eco-efficient than any animal product. They return a great deal because, of course, they are not consumers. They are producers of plants. We don't have chlorophyll. We can't do this magical thing called photosynthesis and turn sunlight and air and water and stuff into things, nutrients or soil building materials. And so, but even within the plant kingdom, there are things which are more eco-efficient than others. And grass is buried at the top of the list. Grasslands, prairies, savannas produce a great deal of fertility in proportion to what they require themselves. They are they're a win-win situation. However, compared to forests, they are not so eco-efficient because trees are much better than grass. If we could eat directly from forests, that'd be wonderful. But to whatever extent we do directly or indirectly eat from trees, we are being far more eco-efficient, more sustainable on the planet. One way we know that is by, if we look at ecosystems around the world, and if we look at all the grasslands, the areas that are perpetually like prairies and savannas and so forth, places like Patagonia and Kenya and Mongolia and Wyoming, and places where grassland is the main ecosystem, it's sustainable climax ecosystem. If we look at those areas, they all share one thing in common, and that is lack of water. If we add water, if we increase the rainfall at any of those ecosystems, they will immediately begin to evolve into forest. Eventually, they become rainforest. They become very lush compared to grassland. So, therefore, I have to assume that given water, that forests are far more eco-efficient. And therefore, if I can't eat from the forest, if I can indirectly eat from the forest. And so what I'm getting at here is, therefore, any forest materials, particularly leaves or chipped up brush and twigs and, the woody stuff, the radial chips, those are far better, if not as food for the food. In other words, as soil building materials. So all I'm getting at there is a roundabout way of saying that as much as I value grass for mulch and compost and so on, I value leaves and forest stuff even more so. That's probably the most radical thing about it, is the degree to which we indirectly eat from the forest. And that means converting those things, obviously, and the way we do that basically is with a chipper shredder, another fossil fuel powered machinery, and I've not found any remedy for that. But we do shred lots and lots of leaves and use them either in the compost system or turning them under directly, or particularly as a mulch. We mulch. I do not do, my system is not a no-till system, but as much as possible I work toward no-till. And one of the complications, or one of the issues we have to consider with no-till, the effort to be no-till, it sounds wonderful, but it's complicated by the fact that most of the plants that we have bred, humans have bred for food, are plants of disturbed soil. They are things which, that's how we discovered them. That's how we became acquainted with them, is around our camps and villages and stuff. Whenever we disturb the soil with a plow or a forest fire or a buffalo wallow or whatever, any place where the soil is disturbed, plants that come back there are not climax plants. They are what are referred to as Band-Aid species. Yeah. When you cut yourself and you're bleeding, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm bleeding. I got to do something. You don't stop and say, well, gee, what am I going to do about my long-term nutrition and da-da-da-da. And they say, oh, nope, got to get a Band-Aid. Got to stop the bleeding right now. Well, most of the plants that we put on our table, be vegetarians or non-vegetarians, are Band-Aid species. And therefore, they're not as eco-efficient as other things, except, say, the grasses and perennial grasses and forest trees. So, given that, that's why I'm needing to do this roundabout cycle where I'm indirectly using the forest for my food source. And again, I'm not trying to have the soil I would love to have the soil be uncovered as much as possible. I mean, have it until undisturbed. But for the most part, I find that very difficult to do, particularly due to the fact that these plants that we're growing have not evolved in that context. They basically are plants of disturbed soil. So we're not being, in some ways, we're not being more natural by using those. We're being less natural. It still may be a good idea. It may be an improvement on nature, but we're not necessarily. It makes it a little more difficult. Anytime you're doing something in a unnatural way, it's more difficult than when you can follow nature. So insofar as we can, we like to.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I've followed a little bit of the literature, the scientific literature on, carbon accumulation in soils. And it seems like more and more people are realizing that the most important thing for the carbon stocks is the roots. And so if you remove I'm not suggesting we go into the forest and remove all the leaves from the forest floor, but at the same time, you can use those leaves for something else without having, maybe as much of a negative impact as you might think on the soil around those trees.
And consider that when we go in and rake the leaves, take the leaves out of the forest, even if we take all of them, and I assume in the long run that would not be a good idea, but most homeowners have a shade tree in the yard or several, and every year they go out and rake them, and they don't generally fertilize those trees. If anything, they may fertilize their lawn. And many people don't even do that. All you do is simply cut it and take it away. Maybe send it to a landfill, or when I was a kid, they burn it and stuff like that. So obviously, the soil is capable of feeding those plants. The soil is not particularly dependent on, especially short term, on what those plants yield. So therefore, if there's such a thing as a free lunch, then that's it. Trees and grass. They give a great deal, huge amount in proportion to what they require.
Yeah.
So yes, if we're using forest residues and removing them, a big advantage to it, of course, is when you turn under a crop, whether green manure crop or plow up a hayfield or prairie or something to make cultivated land. You do, in fact, it's kind of an ecocide. You're annihilating everything, including the root system, disturbing the whole soil community and all of that. Whereas with a forest, you're not disturbing anything. You're simply removing materials from it, and you're also removing things that system can most spare, can most do without. You're not just simply stealing from Peter to pay Paul.
Mm-hmm.
So as much as I can, I want to do that. I do disturb the soil quite a lot. And so when I do disturb the soil, my goal is pretty much everywhere is to get it covered as soon as possible. So in other words, in the spring, I may till the soil, either with a rototiller or most cases, very shallowly with a wheel hoe, which I'm barely disturbing the soil about like an inch or two deep. But still, you do have bare dirt there. And particularly here in the north, where we have cold, wet springs. We want soil to warm up as soon as possible for crops to go in. Then yes, I do that to stir up the soil and then get the crops in. But then as soon as the crops are up, usually just 2 or 3 inches or so, I like to then mulch them. And again, so they spend most of the year under cover, even though they're early spring. I like to have them covered through the winter and through the hot summer weather. But in the springtime, we usually disturb the soil and then replace the cover. If I do it with a dead mulch, like shredded leaves or with hay, the main thing I like much better about shredded leaves is it's so quick and easy to apply. Any gardeners who have used hay or straw mulch appreciate how tedious it can be to you bend over putting mulch around all these plants, and when you do, you never can get such a close job, but there's still always some weeds coming up right where the plant is. You can't get a very intimate, close cover with straw and hay. Whereas with shredded leaves, one can get much more. And I don't bend over to apply that mulch. I basically stand up and walk down the path between the rows with a big, usually a trash can full of shredded leaves, what I call confetti, because that's about the texture that they are when I use them. And I just basically make a blizzard of shredded leaves right over the whole plant. I don't pay attention where the plants are, where the bare soil is. It's over the whole thing. And it basically settles down around the plants. And if done thoroughly enough, I'll have a very thorough cover right up to and around the plants. And also because they're flat flakes, as opposed to the straw, they are much more effective in repressing weeds and also holding on soil moisture and keeping fertility from volatilizing into the air and so forth. So they're much more effective. So I use plenty of hay, but for mulch, whenever possible, insofar as possible, I use shredded leaves, and particularly with close together crops, which most of my crops are. I garden very intensively, where most of my things are in rows, like 8 inches or a foot apart between rows, and that would be much more difficult to mulch thoroughly with hay or leaves. But with hay or straw, but with grass, again, I can get much more close between them, and in a much shorter time. It doesn't take very much time to apply that. Using the blizzard approach.
Yeah, I also I loved your description of so you have a small background in mining, which I'm curious about, but how mining companies would look at the mineral composition of the leaves in places to see what minerals might be present in high amounts, just to get to the point of how leaves can actually be very high in certain minerals. So can you talk a little bit about your history with mining, just because I think that's interesting?
First of all, that's kind of peripheral, not related to it, except that it ended up being a a grow-up lesson for me. When I started out, I actually thought one time when I was planning on being a mining engineer, I actually thought I was going to, I don't know why I was into mining. I was very much in mineral collecting. I was intrigued by it. And one of my first jobs when I left home was as a prospector for Anaconda, a copper mining company, and searching for deposits of copper, lead, zinc, silver, and so on. And when, in the course of this venture, I did manage to earn some money to help me get through college. But beyond that, the main thing I got out of it is I learned that I don't want anything to do with that. It's a very filthy business. It's no very green way of mining. The best way of making mining green is by recycling, taking all those materials that end up in the landfill or whatever, and using them again and again and again. They should be part of our national treasury, whether it's gold or even if it's just aluminum or copper or whatever. We should just use them again and again, and not just tear apart the soil to do it. And so it was that experience. We're talking about back when I was like 16 years old when I first left home to work for Canadian mining companies, and I appreciated very early that this is not a way that I wanted to go. And that's when I became increasingly interested, intrigued by the idea of organic farming, gardening as a way of getting food, because I realized it's a similar situation, is we're extracting minerals from the soil and sending them off to market. And ultimately, we put them on a plate in our food, and we poop them and pee them out and send them off to, back in those days, a lot of it went directly there was before there was so much recycling and the processing of sewage basically went into the ocean. And this obviously was not a sustainable way of living or of eating. So yes, as I started using leaves and things like that, I asked the question that you're getting at right now is, what are the minerals that are in there? Where do they come from and where they go? And I'm generally not very analytical with my system. I've only done 3 or 4 soil tests in my whole life on the farm. I do not do it. Some people several times a year, we're always testing the soil to see if the magnesium level is right and all that. Basically, I have a much more cruder and I believe holistic approach is I keep adding lots of stuff to the soil and assume that somewhere in there I'm getting all of these things. Moreover, not only getting them, but getting them in an appropriate balance, which is not necessarily the case when you import things. When you import lime and phosphate and all those things, there's always a concern of getting too much or too little of something. And my assumption, a sort of blind faith assumption, is if I'm using a lot of hay and leaves and all these things, they must have all those things in them, including the trace minerals and stuff in them, because the plant itself, the tree or the grass, required them and took them up selectively according to its needs. So if all these materials are coming from basically plant residues, then they must have all of the things that the plant originally had to live, and therefore it must be adequate for the plants that will live from those residues, from the compost or the mulch. So I know that can be simplistic in some ways. There are some minerals, trace minerals, boron is a good example, which simply might not be there in the soil to begin with, or may have been lost through erosion or volatilization or leaching or whatever, and simply are not there. They may have not been even in the rocks that the glacier brought down, that was ground up and deposited. Most things are there, or in there in adequate amount. But a few things, like boron, iodine is another one. The makers simply be scared. And in those cases, there's probably no option except for to import them from somewhere where they are, in the form of borax or in the form of seaweed, let's say, things that have them in it. But again, if we're trying to be sustainable, we want to add those things to the soil, import them to the soil once. And then after that, we want them to keep going, keep them in the system, don't allow them to escape, so that as soon as a piece of some kind of organic matter, root matter or something, the plant dies and begins decaying, that it is immediately taken up by some other plant form, whether it's a mold or an earthworm or a grass root or something. It becomes part of another living thing. And so it spends very, very little time in solution in this decay. So therefore, it's not as vulnerable to any of those losses. That's the key thing. So we want to, if we do import things, make sure we import them once and forever.
Yeah.
Not lose them. And that's one of the reasons why I'm also very glad that my focus was on self-sufficiency instead of selling food. Because when we send stuff out to the market, again, we get into the cake mixer thing. We're buying minerals in from somewhere else. We don't know where. We don't know, except for doing a laboratory test. We don't know if we have the balance right. And we import them. And incidentally, an awful lot of carbon footprint is involved in mining, extracting those things, transporting them hundreds of thousands of miles to get them here, and put them in the soil. And then, again, to harvest the crop and send it off to market, where it may or may not end up becoming part of the soil again. So it's a difficult thing to deal with. But again, because of my focus on self-sufficiency, I've kind of avoided that because they're automatically, everything I end up eating and pooping out ends up being composted, ends up back in the soil. Now, that becomes a bit of a dilemma for someone who is trying to make a living by growing and selling food. How do we do that sustainably?
Right.
And because if you're selling your customer, unlike when I eat my food and I compost the residue from my pee and poop and stuff, your customer at your farm stand or whatever, your restaurant or whatever, doesn't do that. They eat the stuff, and theirs is probably going to go into the sewage system and maybe never gets back on the cropland. So that raises the dilemma for me, is how to do that. Can we, in fact, have commercial gardening, farming, and still have it be sustainable and eco-efficient? I believe it can, but it's difficult to do. It's particularly when we don't control so many of the inputs and outputs. It's hard to work around that. Something I give a lot of thought to, because, in fact, even though most of my life I have not been selling food, I am at this late stage of my life getting more interested in market gardening. Would like to try to several of us are interested in trying to form a veganic community of people who are basically self-sufficient and using plant foods as a basis of that. And in doing so, it would be great to be able to get our livelihood instead of having to go out to get jobs somewhere else, to be generating our livelihood, our income from the soil. And again, so then I find myself, for once in my life, in a situation of a market gardener. If I'm going to grow food and sell things, and I'm trying to not only be something, but wear a hat which is not natural to me, which does not fit me very well, which is that of a businessman, not just an organic hippie back to nature farmer. That's so cool. But now I'm trying to be a business-like about it, and yet not compromise this sustainability, eco-efficiency value that has always been part of my vision.
Yeah.
I don't know where that's going to go. I'm still working on that. Maybe whether or not I'll live long enough to come up with good answers to that or not. I hope so. I'm doing okay so far. If I can stop getting into car accidents, maybe I'll make it.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden Podcast is brought to you by Farmer's Friend. In a world where the threat of food insecurity is quickly becoming the new norm, Farmer's Friend exists to equip, educate, and inspire growers to change the world through regenerative agriculture. Small farms are the future, and the future is now. If you need quality tools and supplies for your vegetable or flower operation, check out their growing selection of innovative and affordable tunnels, tools, tarps, and much more. Here at my home farm, we rely heavily on Farmer's Friend for our production. We have 3 of their caterpillar tunnels. We use the silage tarps for occultation. Their row covers have gotten us through hard winters. And of course, the quick cut greens harvester has sped up our baby greens harvest tremendously. Visit farmersfriend.com/no-till today. That's farmersfriend.com/no-till, or visit the link in the show notes and get free shipping on your entire order.
Hey everyone, this is Clara Coleman, and I just wanted to pop in here real quick and say that if you're enjoying this show, you may also enjoy my own show, the Winter Growers Podcast. I interview growers from all over the world about how they produce year-round, especially through the winter months. We talk about the infrastructure, the mental and physical challenges, the tips and tricks, and I even include a thought-provoking lightning round of questions at the end of each conversation. You can subscribe to the Winter Growers Podcast wherever you get podcasts, or subscribe to the No-Till Growers Network on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for letting me jump in, and I look forward to seeing you there. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming.
I do want to get back to the humanure part a little bit. So you talk about that a good amount in the book, but you mentioned that you don't actually consider it to be, it is an important part of your nutrient budget. And I know you're not actually, measuring your nutrient budget, but it's not providing everything. So you still are using legumes and you're still getting other sources. Legumes obviously are producing the nitrogen in place, but can you talk a little bit about how important the humanure and the urine are to your system versus legumes and other sources of nitrogen?
Yes. By all means, the manure is figuratively and literally a drop in the bucket in terms of the fertility thing. I'll use many tons of hay and leaves and residues and stuff in the course of the year to maintain the soil fertility of my land, and maybe 4 to 6 at the most wheelbarrowfuls of composted doo-doo. And that also, by the way, includes lots and lots of the bedding, which is shredded leaves, sometimes sawdust, but usually shredded leaves. And so even that. So the manure is really a very small part of this. And there's no way in the world that one could fertilize one's soil. I remember many years ago, someone came up with this theory or this idea, hypothesized that if you were to compost all your bodily waste, they would give you the fertility to produce what you take in. And that is absurd. It's simply not the case, because there's all kinds of destruction in there of fertility. It would not be anywhere near enough to meet the needs of your garden or food system. So, in fact, it is small enough that if I didn't have it at all, I could still maintain my fertility, even if I did like conventional agriculture does and put them all in the landfill or send it to the ocean or whatever. The thing is, it's too precious to throw away, even though this is the catch-22 here. It's very small. It's not adequate by any means to maintain your fertility, but it's too valuable to waste. And so, because it is very rich. After all, the food we eat is rich. We put some wonderful things into our mouths, and a big part of that comes out the other end sooner or later. So that all the nutrition that's in there should not be thrown away. And so there's part of the irony of market gardening trying to be sustainable is you don't control that part of it, but one can continue to garden the farm ecologically by using everything but that, by not using any human manure at all. If we can't control it, retrieve it, capture it, put it back in the soil, the things that basically keep the fertility system going are, again, the plant foods things. So sometimes people say that we're trying to farm like Mother Nature. Well, Mother Nature uses animals for fertility. That is absolutely true. But if we ask ourselves, how does Mother Nature do it? If I look at my land without me on it, and if you look at 80 acres or so of land, and you see that it supports maybe one or two big stupid ungulates, let's say mammals like deer or something like that, okay? Or me, when they can do both. And it may support dozens of rabbits and bunnies and foxes and weasels and all the various animals that are there, and thousands of little small things and millions of earthworms and trillions of bacteria. So that's the way Mother Nature gardens with animals. Is the animals are basically destroyers. They break down organic matter, make it available again, but they do not add anything to the system. Because again, they are consumers and not producers. They do not do this photosynthesis stuff. So if you remove them from the situation, they are essential. They have a place to be there. They're part of the diversity that makes life work. And again, because they destroy and break things down, that's a valuable service. Animals, including ourselves, we provide a service to the ecosystem, but we don't provide any material. We are net destroyers. And so, and therefore, we have to keep in mind that there are so many of those big, stupid mammals that our land can support, and I'm one of them. And so if I'm going to have a cow there also, there's not really room enough for both of us. And so I'm a human, and I prefer to have humans than cows or deer or other things here. Not that those things don't have a place in the ecosystem, but the part that I control of it is I'm controlling that for human beings. So I don't intend to support and keep those animals there. Also, I just generally I've never liked to. I'm also down on companion animals and things like that, because basically I've always felt like I like animals. Somebody says if you're a vegan, then you're concerned about. Well, I am concerned about animals, but I'm particularly concerned about free animals, wild animals, and the idea of having animals that I have to castrate and corral them and ultimately maybe euthanize them. Or whatever, do take animals and treat them in a way which is very contrary to where they would be if they were wild and natural. And so I want to avoid that. I basically, I'm sometimes even skeptical about putting up bird feeders because I feel like I want to have a cooperative relationship with those animals, but I do not want to control them. I don't want them to control my life, and I don't control theirs either. So my veganism goes to the extent, unlike most vegans, an awful lot of vegans get into veganism because of companion animals. That's the main thing that they make. They're always trying to come out with some kind of plant-based cat food and things like that, which to me is ridiculous. I'd rather have those animals be on their own, doing their own thing without depending on me. Mm-hmm. And so that's a different level, different dimension of my veganism aside from the eco-efficiency thing.
So getting back to the nitrogen, you do grow quite a bit of legumes in your various rotations. And one of the things I really enjoyed reading in your book is your description of all the different clovers that you have worked with. So they all kind of have personalities and niches. So could you talk about the different clovers and getting back also to the mulch and some of your living mulches and where you see different clovers fitting into your system?
Yeah, I like the way you described them as having different personalities. In a sense, that's quite true. But first of all, I want to focus on you're focusing, and most people too, tend to focus obsessive with legumes for nitrogen. They're extremely valuable because they do fix nitrogen. But people, I think, tend to obsess about legumes for nitrogen. They're an excellent source of nitrogen, and they're a net source of nitrogen, by the way. They're taking it out of the air. So that's where otherwise would not become part of the biosphere, part of the ecosystem. So that's very valuable. But we have to keep in mind that lots of other foods have, other plants have nitrogen in them too. All plants have some nitrogen because they require it themselves. Leaves and root structure, they have nitrogen, just not maybe a bigger percentage as the legumes that are fixing nitrogen. And the same thing, by the way, goes in our diet. Everyone I know that the people that are vegans always seem to focus on, where's the nitrogen? If we don't get it from animals, good heavens, where are we going to get it from? And so we're going to have to eat a lot of legumes, a lot of soybeans and stuff like that. And again, all of the foods that we eat have some nitrogen and some protein in it, which is kind of the dietary equivalent of nitrogen, is in the form of protein. Watermelons have nitrogen in them, have protein in them. Not enough, perhaps, by themselves, but all those things have certain amounts of it. So if we eat lots of food generally, we are probably going to get pretty much all of those things in it by focusing on any one little special thing. I'm going to eat food yeast or spirulina algae or tofu or something. I think that's a overly narrow view of food and of nutrition. The things I'm saying now basically are kind of making the analogy, which is a strong analogy, between soil nutrition, i.e. fertility, and human nutrition as in food and diet. And there are the parallels that come up there sometimes striking, including this nitrogen protein thing. And so basically, I don't analyze the food on my plate. I don't know. I have no idea if there's such a thing as protein or not. Maybe it's something I've just read in books. I've never seen a protein. But I've seen potatoes and I've seen cabbage. I've seen them on my plate. I know they taste good, they feel good, and they make me feel happy and energetic. So I'm generally satisfied those things have enough of those things in it. I do not go out of my, except for vitamin B12, I do not take supplements. I assume that those nutrients are in my food, and if I eat a wide variety of organically grown foods, I will get them. So going back to the clover analogy, I use clover a lot. It's great, but I do not consider it the end all. I could not, if it didn't work on my system at all, I could manage very nicely. As far as different clovers, I mainly you pick up a lot of that one, and rightly so. I focus on different clovers for the different niches. Some clovers. For example, red clover, to get the full benefit of red clover, you really need to have two seasons of it to get the full nitrogen nodule production and stuff. If you try to use it as a catch crop, a fill-in crop, put some red clover in here, you won't get as much from it as opposed to white or ladino clover. If I was going to put something in for like a couple months, a short season clover, then I would probably use that. Or even more, I might use peas, field peas. If I'm going to have a really short barrel, I'm only going to a matter of weeks, then it will do a lot of what it does at a very short season. Probably the opposite extreme is alfalfa. If I want to get a piece in alfalfa and want to still be there, a piece of hayfield, for example, wanted to be in alfalfa for the next 20 or 30 years, legume, I would probably put alfalfa because alfalfa is very good at continuing on and on and on. There are some of the clover, if it's hot, dry weather, then I would maybe go more with ladino or certainly alfalfa. If the soil is really sterile to begin with, very sandy or gravelly soil, I would probably go with vetch, another legume which is very good at making a lot from nothing. So even if you have poor humus level in the soil, clovers will do very well in soil which is lacking in nitrogen because, again, they fix their own nitrogen. But they need humus, and part of the reason they need humus is they're getting their nitrogen from the air. They're taking the nitrate nitrate. They're taking the atmosphere N2 nitrogen and converting it to nitrate and nitrite, or vice versa, and putting in the soil. But they're going to have access to the soil, to the air. So in other words, you have soils which are compressed and low in humus, then your legumes, any of them, clover or whatever, will not be as effective at fixing nitrogen. So in some ways, the main thing you need to do to get soils doing well with clover is to increase the humus level in them. It may be mainly carbon-based humus. It does not have to have a high level of nitrogen because, again, that's what the That's what the clover is all about. But it needs a lot of humus, which basically aerates the soil, keeps the soil open so that atmospheric nitrogen can penetrate into the soil and be converted by the legumes into soil nitrogen.
What about your approach to overseeding or interseeding clovers into some of the standing crops? And what's your timing with that? And which crop species and clover species do you prefer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I wish I could do it more universally, and I probably could do it more than I do. But there's some things that totally lend themselves to that. And particularly, I do that with corn, with sunflowers, which we grow lots of. The way that I do it is, see, those are crops which are very spaced far apart. And so there's a lot of bare soil between them if you don't mulch them. So I need to mulch them with something, either dead mulch or living mulch. And so if I can use a living mulch, that means the soil is actually creating fertility while the crop that it's surrounded by is also creating. In other words, while I'm growing my cabbage or soybeans or corn or whatever, it at the same time, it's not the next season we'll grow green manure. At the same time the crop is growing, it's producing green manure. And so, yeah, one of the ways that I do that is, let's use corn as an example. If I'm planting, whether it's field corn or sweet corn or popcorn, basically all the same. If I use the conventional spacing of it, which is to say rows about 2 or 3 feet apart and about a foot apart between plants in the row, then I'll sow them early in the season and they're growing. And incidentally, in with them, another legume that I use is a companion plant, which gives me both food and fertility. In corn, I use soybeans, either green edamame soybeans or regular yellow dairy-type soybeans, and put them right in with the corn. And so they're growing together, and the space in between them, of course, is bare soil if I don't do anything else. And when I hill up the corn, the last set up around the 4th of July, then I seed between it, I'll sow clover. Usually a white clover, because of it's going to have a shorter season, but maybe red clover too. The clover comes up and germinates, but it's not happy because as the season goes on, the corn is getting taller and taller and blocking out the sun. So that clover sits there kind of cursing my ancestors and I'm really resenting that I planted it, and it's not happy there. But it's doing one thing. It's striking root. It's germinating and it's putting roots down, and it's just sitting there gloomy in the shade of the corn. Okay, so late in the season, when the corn is harvested and I remove the corn stalks and everything, all of a sudden that clover looks up and it sees the sky, and the world is its oyster. It's ready to go ahead and function a lot, and it will, in the remaining weeks of the season, do what it can, which is not too much because it doesn't have too much season left, and it's getting colder and colder every day. But the clover is now making some modest growth. So by the end of that year, I've gotten an, albeit rather modest, yield crop of clover there, which I could turn under for its fertility. However, it would not be all that much then. It'd be worth doing, but not as much as it could be, because the clover is so hardy. Is I would just let it go dormant, and it sits there over the wintertime under the snow. And come springtime, as soon as the snow goes, the clover comes up again and starts again to make some growth. And again, it will make a relatively short, small amount of growth before I have to till it under or do whatever I'm going to do if I'm going to follow it with another food crop. But that means I've got 2 short season crops in there, which is the equivalent of a whole season of clover. And the combined amount of nitrogen and generally of roots and stubble and residue and stuff that I get from it is very considerable. It's fairly dramatic. So I do that wherever I can. I do that between corn and with sunflowers, which I more or less do the same way, except when it comes to my sunflowers. I plant my sunflowers in hills like I do my corn, and in among them I plant pole beans. And those whole beans climb up, and they not only give me a crop of beans, but they also, their vines, as they sprout on, will tie the sunflowers together, so the sunflowers don't lodge or tip over as badly as they otherwise might. And I get a fruit crop along with it. Okay, well, I do the exact same thing. At a certain time of year, I'll plant clover in amongst it, And the same thing is with the corn. I get 2 partial seasons of growth. So those are my 2 favorite crops to use with intercropping with clover. But a lot of other things work well. I will do that. Sometimes usually I do it with cabbage and Brussels sprouts and broccoli, those plants that are spaced, a couple of feet apart. I also the clover a little late. And in this case, it makes a big difference which clover I do. I don't like red or yellow clovers, red or white clover so much in that, because it will tend to make a lot of lush growths around the cabbage, will tend to harbor slugs, or even if it doesn't compete with the clover, it'll compete for sunlight, even though it's not competing for fertility or nitrogen. And so what I prefer to use there is if I have my rows of cabbage, let's say 2 feet apart, then I'll have a row in between them, which is to say 1 foot from the cabbage, which I will sow white flat Dutch clover.
Uh-huh.
It's a totally different type of clover. It doesn't grow tall. It's slow. It sprawls, makes a mat, and it will spread out and it'll grow underneath the cabbage. But it basically doesn't grow tall enough to affect the cabbage at all. So I'm getting 2, and also I often plant a companion crop of green soybeans or something else, lettuce or endive or something else in between the cabbage plants, which gets harvested usually before the cabbage needs that space. So I'm getting 3 crops from them. I'm getting the cabbage and whatever that intercrop is, and I'm also getting my red clover. And sometimes I'm trying to work on the details of this. Is also use shredded leaf mulch among the Dutch white clover, so that I'm getting 3 food crops and also an additional fertility crop in the sense of my leaves. I'm getting the fertility value of that mulch. This is getting very intensive. This is getting very. This is taking a lot of attention to schedules, doing several things to a crop. It's difficult to do if you're doing it alone, but if enough people are focusing on this, you can very much increase your yield from a very small space. One of my most inspiring sources of such information is a book which I believe is still in print called Farmers of 40 Centuries. It was written way back around 1910 by a guy who was at that time was the head of what today is the USDA.
Yep.
And this guy spent several months actually, touring Japan, Korea, and China, and making his observations of it. And this guy was very impressed. He did not have the hubris that most modern agronomists and agriculturalists have. He was very impressed by what he saw these people, and that's why he calls them farmers of 40 centuries. His emphasis that these people have been doing these things for 4,000 years. And still without wearing out the soil. And he's very impressed by the very intensive methods that they do. They would often have a crop growing at this point in time, another crop growing in a soil being seeded about that time, and when it comes out, the other one goes in, and so on. So you have sometimes 3 or 4 very elaborate constellations of crops on the same piece of land, giving either food or fertility and so on. He was very impressed by that, so as I am. So I've been very inspired by reading the details of how that works.
Yeah, I read that book quite a number of years ago as well, and it is certainly a little dated in the language, but the concepts are really poignant, and there's a lot of great photos of night soil collection. And my husband is from Japan, so we went to a museum once, and there happened to be an exhibit all about night soil and collecting urine, and it was really interesting. So yeah, I would recommend that as one of those classic books, revolutionary agricultural books, if people haven't read it.
The societies of Asia in general have been very intensive with that for centuries, because they have to be. They have a very dense population. They cannot. In our country, we don't even have discussions about using human manure in agriculture. It's kind of embarrassing. People don't even want to. We don't want to do that. We want to get rid of that stuff somehow by sweeping it under the rug. And those people don't. They use it. They process it properly so that it is not. It's still hygienic, but that's too much fertility to waste, and they don't have the luxury of letting that stuff flushing it down the toilet. So yeah, I got a lot of inspiration from those sources.
Kind of switching gears. We don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to. You're maybe most well known for your seed saving work and the Scatterseed Project. So, could you talk a little bit about the Scatterseed Project?
Yeah. So far, what we've been talking about is basically trying to be self-sufficient as far as fertility and growing food and the food for the food. But from the very beginning, I was aware that there's something less than sustainable about going back to the seed catalog year after year after year. And particularly, I had been here for not that many years when I discovered, basically through some neighbors, that there are some things out there which are not on the shelf, quote unquote, that are not available commercially. I worked for a dairy farmer down the road, and he had several things in his garden. He had a cow horn potato. He had a type of lima bean, which wasn't a lima bean at all. It's a white runner bean from North Carolina that he got. He'd been maintaining these for years. He got them decades earlier than that. And they're not in any seed catalog, and they were very, very useful. They were very well adapted for my, not only my climate, but my uses. I can't grow lima beans here practically, but white runner beans, which look like and taste like, they're just like a very fat lima bean. And so those are very exciting to me. But again, if I was going to grow those, I had to save the seed. There was no catalog company I could go back to get them year to year. So I ended up with several of those. And then in the process of doing that, I became aware that there were thousands of varieties in the country, in any area, of so-called heirloom varieties which maybe in some cases were never in the commercial catalog or were long since dropped, and some individuals, some families, some community were keeping them going. And so I started collecting those, and to not only for my own use, but increasingly just simply to preserve them and make them available to others. And that's what I now call my Scatterseed Project. I have maintained thousands of varieties over the years. Over the years, I've offered at least 5,000 varieties of crops, not only beans and cabbages and things, but also tree crop varieties, berries, plum, apple varieties, kiwi varieties, grains, and so forth, making them available to people to promote them. So in recent years, I'm having a lot of trouble with that. My collections have more or less collapsed, and I'm trying to resurrect them due to several years of slashed funding. I've lost a lot of the varieties. The good news is that I can get them, most of them I can get back from my original source, whether it's from the USDA or from some organization like Seed Savers Exchange or something. Some of them are much more difficult to get. Some of them, like the heirloom varieties, maybe the person I got them from has been dead a long time ago. The good news about that is I've been sharing these varieties with others, so in many cases I can get that variety, I can retrieve it from someone who originally got it from me. And that's very great. That's how it's supposed to work. We're basically covering each other's backs. And so that's what I'm in the process of trying to do now, trying to not only establish more secure, more sustainable funding so I can claw back these collections and get them back available again, but given that I'm 74 years old, I want to eventually get my Scatterseed Project so it's not just little Bonsall. Get some younger people involved with it, running it, so that I can feel free to die and know that these things are going to continue without me. I want to get the thing to be really sustainable over time.
Is there somewhere, that's a great point. Is there somewhere people can get involved, or where should people go for more information about how to help you with that?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, they can look at my website, which has not been updated. It's very obsolete. I've got it since sometime this winter, updating the information in it. But the simplest way, most direct way, is to paraphrase the slogan of the Maine Forest Service, say, keep Maine green, send money. And I can use that to hire help and whatever to do some of these things. So that helps me directly keep the project going, getting grants and things like that. But in the long run, the main thing that someone can do is become a seed saver themselves. Whether they become a crazy person like Will Bonsall keeping thousands of varieties, or whether they simply learn to take responsibility for their own seeds, and seeds today, the things that you eat, that you put on your table. And I focus on that in my book. There's a whole section on plant propagation, and including sexual plant propagation like seed saving. When people ask me what things I'm getting a seed saving, what things should I save seeds of? And my first focus is eventually you have to do anything and everything, however much you want and can do. But first of all, what are the things that you're growing right now and that you're in the habit of putting on your plate? Because I'm confident that a lot of people get into seed saving as a labor of love. frankly, have become very cynical about labors of love. They tend to not be very sustainable. Eventually they become impractical and burdensome, and people stop doing them. But if there's some particular kind of bean or tomato or potato or whatever that you really like growing, your family loves it, you eat it year after year, and you can you can't buy it in the store, then I'm pretty confident that you're going to take responsibility for that seed. You will do it right, because whether you have it to eat or not, it's no labor of love. It's if I want to eat this fruit, that I've got saved seed of it. So I'd like to see people doing that. Look at the stuff that you're growing right now and become competent at growing them. I'd like to see more people doing minor crops, particularly biennials, which most people, they'll say beans and tomatoes. They're easy to do. But I like to see Maine people saving their own. If they grow Brussels sprouts to eat, they'll learn how to save the seed of those Brussels sprouts, and so on. And so there are some good sources. Like there is, as I said in my book, there's a pretty exhaustive section on seed saving. A very good book that I would recommend by Suzanne Ashworth called Seed to Seed. It's an excellent book in very great depth about saving your own seeds. That's what comes to mind so far. But
Great.
Very much encouraged you. Incidentally, at the Common Ground Fair every year, I give talks on several topics, including seed saving, which happens all 3 days of the fair. If anyone happens to be in the area, if you go to the Common Ground Fair, because it's a wonderful thing to go to.
Yeah.
But if you're there, stop by our area, the Ag Demo area, and catch one of my talks on seed saving.
Yeah. For those listeners, that is the fair in Maine, which is sponsored by the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners, and it's usually the third weekend in September, I think. Yeah. You mentioned kiwis, and in your book you talk very lovingly about kiwis. I actually interviewed someone at UNH last season for the podcast.
Right. Yeah, Iago.
Yeah, Iago. So it's nice to hear someone, another real kiwi fan. Are there other unusual crops that you think people might fall in love with, that they might not even have heard of?
Well, probably lots of them. If I were to think of all of them, we'd probably be here all day. But incidentally, one of the things about kiwis is these are not the conventional kiwi that you get from the grocery store, the fuzzy egg-sized New Zealand kiwi. These are hardy kiwis, which are the same genus but a different species. And the regular kiwis will not grow here, but hardy kiwis are very hardy here. And they tend to grow on clusters like grapes. And they are not fuzzy. You don't peel them, you pop them in your mouth like grapes. And they are absolutely delicious. I've sometimes suggested that the state legislature should pass some legislation banning people from eating these things in mixed genders at the same place at the same time, because they make you go absolutely bonkers. They taste so good. They make you give up any claims to morality you might have. If you're eating a hardy kiwi, you'll totally lose it. They used to say that in the early days, tomatoes were looked at skeptically as being an aphrodisiac and all that. And that's nonsense, of course. But with kiwis, absolutely. Yes. But there are lots of other foods. I'm trying to think of some that we grow that most people do not. One of my favorite crops, by the way, is what we call pterosols. Most other people know them as Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes. And they are basically a tuberous sunflower. And they are, I believe, very, very sadly neglected. They are extremely easy to grow and very, very productive, very eco-efficient, and very, very good to have, and very, very tasty. I use them in my diet many ways. A lot of people grow them just basically to use as a vegetable, steam them, put them in stir fries and stuff, which is wonderful. But I use them many other ways. I actually use them as a grain extender. I'll take the tubers and shred them coarsely in my salad master and dry them out, and then grind up the shreds into a fine meal and use it in my breakfast cereal, put it in cornmeal porridge and things like that as a grain extender. I love it. It's very, very neglected, and the food has much more potential than it is accorded, than it is used for. Other things, let's see, another one occurred to me, but then I lost it.
That's okay. You do have quite an extensive list of unusual crops in your book, and I would really recommend to people that they check out your book. I got it from my local library, and and it was a great read. It was also, not just information packed, but you are a very entertaining writer. I really enjoyed reading it as well.
Sometimes people call it cheeky.
Yeah, I think cheeky sounds appropriate. Yeah. And for someone, I'm used to writing and reading scientific articles where there's not a lot of room for cheekiness, so it was quite enjoyable.
I tend to do that. I guess I'm naturally that way, but I tend to deliberately put that kind of a twist on it because I don't want anyone to fall asleep while they're reading my stuff. I want to get their attention, and so a bit of a song and dance along with it helps to make it easy to remember things. We seem to remember things that we learn with a chuckle. Things that we learn with a laugh. We tend to keep them much more than something we learn much more seriously. So I tend to do it kind of automatically.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate it. And I had a great time talking with you today. I'm glad we could finally connect. I wish you the best of luck in your healing, getting through the winter. Best of luck in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, and best of luck with the baby.
Thank you. I will let you know when this, I don't know if you ever listen to podcasts, but I will let you know when it comes out, and I'll send you a link so that you can listen to it if you want. I sometimes find it painful to listen to myself, but everybody's different.
That'd be wonderful. I'd like to work very much to hearing that.
Thanks as always for listening, and quick shout out to my friend Nick for suggesting I interview Will in the first place. It was definitely worth the wait. I was going to say check out the show notes for more information, and you should totally do that. But Will Bonsall is such a legend. If you just Google him, you'll find lots. He's even got his Wikipedia page. That, legend. Till next time.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that episode. A few things real quick. I just returned from the Utah Food and Farming Conference in Cedar City, Utah, and that was amazing. It was a lot of fun. The people of Utah are wildly nice, and I got to meet a lot of really great growers from that area. Sounds like Salt Lake City has it really going on. That's super cool. I hope to see that one day. So keep that Food and Farming Conference in Utah there on your radar for next year. If you're in that Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado area. It's a goodie, and it's pretty close to Vegas, which is a very enigmatic and large pile of lights where water can be shot 430 feet into the air, but will dribble out of your faucet. Does the Bellagio Hotel have good water pressure? I'd be curious to know. Anyway, next week, as always, I will be at the Organic Association of Kentucky conference called Oak, here like 15 minutes from my home farm. Then I am super excited to be doing a nerdy Farmer Jesse workshop in mid-February with the Dallas Inner City Growers. They're in Texas. Check the show notes for more details on that. I don't get to Texas that often, so come hang. I will also be at Marbleseed in Wisconsin towards the end of February, but not presenting. I'm just going to be hanging out. I will also be at the Organic Grower School outside of Asheville, North Carolina in March. And I thought that would be the last one, but I was actually wrong. I will actually be in Riverside, California for the Grow Riverside and Beyond conference in early April. So that should be a blast. And I will see you then, Southern California. All the links for those are in the show notes, and also linked in the show notes is our shop where you can find my book, The Living Soil Handbook, and hats and other merch. Those things helps to support our work. So we really appreciate it. Alternatively, you can join the hundreds of donors who support us at patreon.com/no-till-growers and who just this week learned of a bunch of new discounts they get for being members from various companies on seeds and for footwear and all sorts of other goodies. So not only can you support our work that way, but get a sweet little bonus in the process. But that page is the absolute lifeblood of our work. And at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Chris Yates, Sean at All About the Garden, and Stephen Smith. Huge shout out to everyone who supports us in whatever way that you can. You all are incredible. Otherwise, thanks for listening.